Valentine's Day. It's a time for love, romance, and extravagant gestures. Couples book weekend getaways, candlelight dinners, and if you're feeling a little adventurous, maybe something more thrilling. At Harbortown Golf Resort, nestled along the scenic Chesapeake Bay, guests were indulging in a unique Valentine's experience, a luxurious overnight stay, a special dinner, and the highlight of the evening, a murder mystery show. The scene was set, a glamorous wedding, an elegant bride, a wealthy groom with dark secrets, and the audience watched, champagne glasses in hand as actors performed, and then it happened. The fake groom clutched his throat, his face twisted in shock, and his body collapsed onto the floor. Gasp filled the room. Was it poison? A vengeful lover? The audience leaned in, captivated. The guests weren't just watching a murder unfold, they were part of the story. They laughed, they guessed, and they whispered their theories to each other. Of course, this was all an act. It was just for fun, a theatrical experience, until a real murder happened that very same night. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 46 of the Darklivity podcast. I'm your host, Kimbyrleigha, and I'm here with my co-host, who is famous for his very short intro every time, Jonathan.
Hi. Darklivity is the dark downward slope into the degradation of the human mind and the consequences that such darkness brings to light.
Speaking of taking you on these journeys to where the cases take place, have you ever stepped into the world of June Parker, the sharp-witted detective with a knack for uncovering the truth in June's Journey, a captivating, free-to-download, hidden object mystery game set in the dazzling backdrop of the 1920s. June's Journey is kindly supporting our channel and sponsoring today's video, but there's something new and exciting about what we're about to tell you. So even if you've heard about June's Journey before, we have a little something special coming up to challenge the detective in all of you.
In the story Tragedy Strikes, June is thrust into a thrilling investigation to solve her sister Claire's murder, as she uncovers long-buried secrets within her own family.
If you like solving crimes, you'll love it. But that's just part of the adventure. From high society parties to shadowy alleyways, June finds herself entangled in puzzling situations, using her keen intellect and charm to help friends in need, all while staying one step ahead of danger. With each new scene, the mystery deepens, and there's a brand new trailer we're about to share, and it's action-packed and mysterious.
Don't do anything rash, Miss Parker.
June's Journey. Play now.
June's Journey takes you on an emotional adventure filled with love, betrayal, family drama, and social injustice. With new chapters being released every week, there's always a fresh mystery to solve and new layers to uncover.
June isn't your typical detective either. She has no badge, no forensics lab, and no access to police files. Instead, she relies on her intuition, social intelligence, and quick thinking to crack the toughest cases. She's a lot like us. So why don't you try it? It's your turn to investigate. Are you ready?
In this crime scene we're showing you on screen, there's a crucial clue right in front of you. Can you spot it? Here's a riddle to help you. If the letter J equals 10 and P equals 16, what do the numbers 6, 15, 15, 20, 16, 18, 9, 14, and 20 mean?
Pause the screen and try to figure it out. Then leave your guess in the comments and we will see who got it right first. If you want to continue solving the mystery, download June's Journey for free on iOS, Android, or PC by using our special link below in the description box or by scanning our QR code on the screen. And thanks so much to June's Journey for sponsoring today's video. And by the way, I'm wearing my CrimeCon shirt. I don't know if you guys can see it. I didn't go to the Orlando one, but this is the only one they had when we did go. Are you coming to see us at CrimeCon? If so, yay, I can't wait. If not, you can get your ticket now because they do sell out, especially the lower tiers. Actually, I think the platinum, which is the highest one, is already sold out. But use our code Kimbyr to get money off. But more importantly, so that we can keep coming back because it shows CrimeCon that you want us there. It's not a lie. They track that. So don't forget to add our names to the little section that asks, what speakers or topics would you like to see the most at CrimeCon? And thanks so much in advance. And we cannot wait to meet you in person. We had so much fun last time. And there's so many cool things to do afterward. Like there's dinner and drinks, and we're going to all get together with, Stephanie and Derek and Annie. So we definitely want to see you there. I don't know what we're going to do for a meetup this time or anything.
I had a blast.
He did, but then we got sick right afterward.
Sure did.
But now let's get serious and let me set the stage for this case. It's Valentine's night after the murder mystery dinner. Everyone has settled into their hotel rooms. And then later, the sound of sirens shattered the night's tranquility. There were fire trucks and police cars racing to room 506. The flickering glow of flames illuminated the exterior of this resort, and inside, thick black smoke curled along the ceiling. The fire was dying out, but the damage had already been done. A man was lying on the floor, motionless. His wife stood outside, hysterical. "Please, you have to help. My husband is inside." This was supposed to be a romantic weekend, but at 1:15 a.m., a 911 dispatcher receives a call from a woman. Her voice is panicked, it's shaky, she's barely coherent, and she's saying, "There's a fire! My husband, he's inside, please, you have to help." Hricko is still in her Valentine's dinner outfit. She sped to the hotel lobby, her car left running outside, and guests are turning to look. She came running to the front desk. "Room 506, it's on fire," she yelled. A guest staying at the resort named Philip Parker, he was in the lobby at the time. He didn't know Kim. He had no idea who she was or what was happening, but hearing the word fire made him act fast. He rushed towards room 506. When firefighters arrived minutes later, black smoke was coming out of the back of this building. The door to room 506, though, was jammed shut. Philip pounded his fists on the door, but there was no answer. Then he noticed the smoke coming from the back of the building and he ran that way, and the sliding glass door was cracked open and smoke was pouring out. It was burning Philip's eyes. He couldn't see anything in front of him. The air was hot and suffocating, but there was no visible fire, just lingering embers. And then that's when he saw him. A man is lying on the floor between the beds. He's not moving. His upper body looked burned, and Philip rushed inside and grabbed him by the legs and dragged his body towards the sliding glass door. He and another guest hauled the man onto the wooden deck outside, but it was too late. The man, whose name was Steve Hricko, was dead. Him and his wife Kim were celebrating Valentine's Day together at this resort. It was supposed to be an unforgettable romantic getaway. But now it would be remembered for all the wrong reasons.
So now that Kimbyr has set the stage, it's time to rewind, to understand who Steve and Kim were, what their marriage was like, and why this romantic getaway was supposed to be a fresh start, but ended in death. Before the fire, before the sirens, before the frantic 911 call, there was a couple doing their best to hold their marriage together. For nearly a decade, Steve and Kim Hricko had lived a life that on the surface seemed stable. They had a home in Maryland, a young daughter named Anna, and steady jobs that kept them comfortable. But beneath it all, they were stressed. For Steve, his family was everything. And for Kim, it became more of an obligation. But it didn't start out this way. Let's tell you more about Steve. Steven, who went by Steve Hricko, was never the loudest person in the room. He didn't chase attention. He didn't thrive on chaos. He was steady, reliable, the kind of man people trusted. He was born on November 22nd of 1962 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He was raised by his parents, Mary Esther and Dr. Michael John Hricko, alongside his three sisters, Julie, Jennifer, and Michelle. And growing up, Steve had one best friend, Mike Miller. They met as kids because their fathers bowled in the same league. But it wasn't until 7th grade at Wesley Park Junior High that they became inseparable. By high school, Steve and Mike were a duo, working together at the Pennsylvania State University's golf course, bonding over long shifts in the sun, cutting fairways, maintaining greens, and learning every inch of the turf. While others his age dreamed of becoming rock stars or having big city careers, Steve had one goal. He wanted to become a golf course superintendent. And he worked for it. But he wasn't just about working. He also had a goofy side, a dry sense of humor that only his close friends got to see. And while some people saw his size 6'2" with a solid build as intimidating, Mike and those who knew him would say Steve was just a big teddy bear. But for all his kindness, loyalty, and work ethic, Steve had one flaw. He believed that if you love someone enough, you could fix anything. And that belief would be his downfall. After they graduated in 1981, Steve enrolled in the turfgrass management program at Penn State. Mike, at the time attending a different school, decided to follow Steve's lead and also join the program. And during this time, Mike was dating Maureen, a 23-year-old waitress at Haas's Steak and Sea House in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Maureen had a coworker named Kim, a 20-year-old woman who had been through a series of bad relationships. Maureen and Mike thought it might be a good idea to set Kim up with Steve, hoping that he could be a positive influence in her life and that, in turn, she could get Steve out of his shell. And one evening, they went on a double date and Steve fell in love with Kim immediately.
Okay, who has heard of Altoona, Pennsylvania lately?
I have.
Do you guys know what case has to do with Altoona, Pennsylvania?
Leave it down in the comments.
The first person, and we can filter, who lets me know what case occurred in Altoona, Pennsylvania or had something to do with it,
Recently.
we will give you a little prize. So let's also give you more insight into Kim and who she was. Kim Ungst was born in 1965. She was raised in Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania, but her childhood was anything but carefree. Her father, Glenn, was in the military and he was deployed to Vietnam. When she was young, her mother, Lois, moved the family while he was away. But by the time Kim was only 4 years old, her parents' marriage had ended in divorce. Her mother remarried in 1970 and Kim grew up with her stepfather and her younger half-brother, Matt. And from an early age, Kim learned to survive under very strict household rules. Her stepfather was controlling. He had bizarre rules about household chores, including allowing ironing only once a week. So if you didn't get it done, you couldn't iron your clothes the rest of that week. She wasn't allowed to date until she was 16, but stayed responsible and avoided trouble. And her stepdad favored his biological son. And this usually left Kim feeling like an outsider in her own home. She did what she had to do to stand out. She pushed herself to be the best. Kim was a straight A student, always at the top of her class. In high school, she was a cheerleader. She was in basketball and a softball player. And she was consistently on the honor roll. Kim was smart and ambitious. At Calvary Baptist Christian Academy, she graduated as valedictorian in 1983. But even academic success wasn't enough. Her stepfather criticized her choices, especially when she decided to attend Messiah College. This was a private Christian school in Grantham, Pennsylvania. Her stepdad wanted her to go to Penn State, but instead, Kim made her own decision. And for a while, she tried to fit into the Christian college lifestyle, but it just wasn't her. Without telling her mother, she left Messiah College and transferred to Penn State's Altoona branch, where she reworked her entire future. Kim wasn't going to be just another small-town girl with a basic degree. She worked as a waitress to support herself, but her real goal was medicine. She pushed through school, eventually earning a nursing degree. But for all her dedication and intelligence, there was another side to Kim. She could be sharp, critical, and very impatient. She didn't just want things done right. She wanted them done her way. She could be cold when people failed her. She didn't hesitate to cut them off. And when life stopped being exciting, she found a way to move on, not caring who she left behind in the dust. Kim and Steve were complete opposites. Steve was a homebody. He liked routine, loyalty, comfort, and Kim was restless, always looking for the next challenge, the next thrill, the next step forward. They never would have ended up together if it wasn't for one thing, an unplanned pregnancy. Kim and Steve had been dating for only about 4 or 5 months when Kim found out she was pregnant in 1988. For Steve, there was only one answer: to propose immediately. And Kim accepted. But it wasn't exactly a love story. It was a logical decision for them. They got married in March of 1989 at Eisenhower Chapel with Mike Miller as Steve's best man, and Maureen, Mike's girlfriend, stood by Kim's side as her maid of honor. On the day of the wedding, Steve had a 103-degree fever, but he didn't complain. He smiled, he played his part, he said his vows. Despite feeling terrible, he kept it to himself and carried on as everything was fine, not wanting to ruin the day for Kim, the woman that he loved.
I'd do the same thing.
I would too. I mean, it's both of their weddings, but I understand a lot of times, the bride and oh, I don't want to upset her or ruin everything that they've waited long to plan.
At the time, Steve worked as an assistant superintendent at Toft Trees Resort and 4-Star Golf Club, continuing his career in the golf course management. A few years later, Steve's career took a step forward when he was hired as the course superintendent at Iron Masters Golf Club, located near Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania. He and Kim moved there to start a new chapter in their lives. A few months later, in August of 1989, their daughter Anna Rose was born. For a while, they played the part of a happy family. They had a home, a new baby, careers, and it was like the couple was ready to settle into the next chapter of their lives.
But the thing was, Kim never seemed satisfied. Steve had always been a hard worker, but at Iron Masters Golf Club, he ran into an unexpected problem: politics. The club's board members were not happy when they found out that this young, relatively inexperienced man was hired to run the course. They actually had someone else in mind, an older employee who had been there a lot longer, someone that they felt deserved the role more than Steve, and suddenly Steve was out. Whether he was pushed out or he left on his own terms, that's unclear, but the outcome was the same. He lost his job. And with a wife and a newborn baby to support, Steve had no choice but to return to where his family lived in State College, Pennsylvania. So they moved in with his parents, and it was supposed to be temporary, just long enough for Steve to find his footing again. But for Kim, this was a step backward. She thought that the man she married was ambitious, and yet here they were living at his parents' house, their independence stripped away, with no clear path forward. And while Steve stayed home with baby Anna, which he actually enjoyed, by the way, Kim threw herself into her studies, enrolling in a program to become a surgical technician.
Steve was a devoted father. He took on the full-time parenting role with ease. He wasn't the type of man who felt emasculated by staying home. If anything, he loved it. His towering 6'2" frame and serious demeanor might have made him seem intimidating to some, but at home, he was Anna's playmate, her protector, her jungle gym. She would climb all over him, put makeup on his face, string plastic jewelry around his neck, and Steve would sit there patiently smiling, letting her turn him into a princess.
I can say that's really good that a dad does that because not everyone is involved, but it's also not that big of a deal to have to stay home while your wife is out, getting her degree so that y'all can have a better life together. And living with your parents is not that bad. I had to do it at 30.
I would let Mazzy put makeup all over me. I'd let Shyla put makeup all over me.
I know you would. And for Steve, these were the best days of his life. But for Kim, it was just another reminder of everything she didn't want. A husband who wasn't working, a life that felt too small, too stagnant, too predictable, and a future that looked nothing like she had imagined. Kim completed her training. She became a surgical technician, and she excelled in this high-pressure environment of an operating room. She found her place in control at the center of action where people relied on her.
At this time, Steve had actually managed to find a new opportunity as well, this time as the assistant superintendent at Sparrows Point Country Club in Dundalk, Maryland. It wasn't the top position, but it was a step back in the right direction. So they packed up and moved, this time to Laurel, Maryland. For a while, things seemed stable again. Kim had secured a job at Holy Cross Hospital working as a surgical tech, and Steve was back on the turf, slowly rebuilding his career, and their best friends Mike and Maureen Miller had also decided to move, now living in Easton, Maryland, where Mike had taken a job at Harbor Town Golf Course. Even though they were a couple hours apart, Steve and Mike still made time for each other, catching up over a couple beers, reminiscing about their days working at the Penn State Golf Course.
And Kim had also found a strong group of friends. She had Rachel McCoy, a woman that she had met in 1986, and they had grown even closer over the years. She also became really close friends with Jenny and Norma, who also worked as surgical technicians at Holy Cross Hospital. They bonded over the chaos of the operating room, laughing between their shifts, venting about the hospital policies. Because when Holy Cross, a Catholic hospital, announced that they would not be covering birth control for their staff, regardless of insurance, guess what? Kim was furious. She didn't just complain, she took action. She reached out to women's advocacy groups and she pushed for policy changes. It was moments like this that defined who she was. When Kim had a cause, she was relentless. She was unafraid to challenge authority.
And by all accounts, Steve and Kim had built a beautiful life, but behind closed doors, the tension was growing. Steve was still the same man he had always been. He was steady, soft-spoken, devoted. But Kim, she still felt restless. She had spent the last 8 years feeling like life was dragging along. Steve was content. He didn't mind the simple moments, the quiet life, the routine of work and home.
But for Kim, that just wasn't enough. The pressure of parenting, the long hours at work, the reality of a husband who no longer excited her, it all weighed on her. She wanted more. She wanted passion, adventure, unpredictability. She didn't want a man who was happy to just sit back and let life happen to him. She wanted a man who was spontaneous, and Steve, that just wasn't who he was. At first, they did try, but the differences between them were just too big. Kim began pulling away. She would criticize Steve. She would call him needy, weak, and unmotivated. He wouldn't help around the house enough, and he never wanted to do anything fun. She started resenting the life they had together. Steve, on the other hand, didn't give up. He would write love letters to Kim, and he kept trying to fix things. His journal entries from January of 1998 were just heartbreaking. Here was a man begging for love that he felt was slipping away. He knew he had to do something, and fast.
The strain was starting to wear on Steve. He had spent months trying to hold everything together, his career, his home life, his marriage. But lately, it felt like he was the only one trying. The pressure at work wasn't helping. Managing a golf course was physically demanding. But it was the unspoken stress of the job, the long hours, the constant scrutiny, the need to prove himself was exhausting. By early 1998, Steve had started taking antidepressants, a combination of Effexor for depression, Xanax for anxiety, and Flexeril as a muscle relaxant. They helped take the edge off, but nothing could ease the growing sense that his wife was slipping away from him.
Yeah, I don't think medication is going to necessarily fix your marriage, but when you are under all that stress, it seems like the last resort.
But some medications do help.
Yes.
Still, he refused to give up. In mid-January, Steve called his best friend Mike Miller. He figured since Mike had known Steve since they were kids, if anyone could give him advice, it was him. Steve told him he wanted to do something special for Kim, something to rekindle what they used to feel and share. Mike thought for a second and then suggested something simple, but very thoughtful, a real break, just the two of them.
Mike was the golf superintendent at Harbortown Golf Resort in St. Michael's, Maryland. This is a quaint waterfront town known for its charming inns, boutiques, shops, and fresh seafood. The resort was offering a Valentine's Day special. For $239, you could get an overnight stay complete with a murder mystery dinner show. Now, I've never done one, and I've heard that they are so much fun, and it sounded really fun. If you aren't familiar, we are going to explain more later, but this getaway sounded romantic, lighthearted, and something different. Steve loved the idea. He booked the room immediately, and he felt this renewed sense of optimism. Maybe this was exactly what they needed. He knew that Kim liked adventure and spontaneity, and St. Michael's seemed like the perfect escape. It was a place that felt far enough from home to be a true getaway, but close enough that they weren't feeling very disconnected from their everyday life. It was about an 1.5-hour drive from where they lived in Laurel. This trip would be all about Kim. He wanted to make her happy again. He wanted to bring back what they had lost. And so, without telling her the full details because he wanted it to be a surprise, he simply marked the date on their shared calendar with "Keep Open."
That morning, she had a sigmoidoscopy, a medical examination used to check the lower part of her large intestine for signs of inflammation or other issues. It was a routine outpatient procedure, relatively quick, lasting about 10 to 20 minutes. But it still left her feeling drained and exhausted. After the appointment, she ran a few errands knowing that the weekend trip with Steve was coming up. She was trying to be excited about it, but she just wasn't. She had even told her counselor early that week that she was tired and just wanted to stay home. But she knew how hard Steve had worked on planning everything. It's just that she didn't believe it would change anything in their marriage. But still, she didn't cancel. Instead, she went on with her day, pushing through the exhaustion long enough to meet up with her friend Jennifer Going for dinner. It was a nice evening, but Kim still felt worn out and disconnected. That night, she barely slept. And by the morning of February 14th, Valentine's Day, she felt even worse. Still, she packed her bags, knowing that the weekend ahead was inevitable. She was going to make the best of it. Steve and Kim dropped off their daughter Anna with a trusted friend before setting off to Harbortown Golf Resort. Steve was talkative the entire drive, trying to keep the mood light and trying to remind Kim of all the reasons they still worked out well together.
But Kim, she barely responded. She was detached, sleeping most of the way, but Steve didn't push her. He wanted things to flow naturally and not put too much pressure on her. And by mid-afternoon, they had arrived. The resort was just as beautiful as Steve had hoped for. Waterfront views, cozy lodges, and just the right touch of quiet romance. As they checked in, Kim still seemed disinterested, going through the motions. Steve smiled. He handed her the room key for 506, and they drove their car towards the building at the end of the resort near the tip of the property, almost like they were on their own little island because it was like surrounded by water on 3 sides. But this resort wasn't like the standard hotel. Instead, the lodges were spread out, with each 2-story building having about 12 rooms. You needed to access them from the outside. Once inside, a small surprise awaited her. The staff had placed a complimentary bottle of champagne on a table, but the real surprise was what was sitting next to it. A wedding invitation. But not for an actual wedding. It was part of the resort's murder mystery dinner. And to me, that sounds like so much fun because it starts right when you get there. Kim picks up the invitation and she's confused at first, and then she starts reading the details. That's when she realized what Steve had planned. He wanted this weekend to be special. He had asked her to pack something nice because tonight they weren't just having dinner, they were solving a murder. And she got a little excited. It was something new, something different, a little thrilling. They would get to play pretend and escape for the evening. And as I said, if you've never done this before, it's a social event where guests are assigned character roles with potential motives for a fictional murder, and everyone has to interact with each other throughout the meal to gather clues and solve the case to figure out who committed the crime. Essentially playing detective while eating dinner. It's like a live action version of the game Clue. And a lot of times there are even specific themes and actors and costumes to match the setting. And for this one, it was supposed to be a wedding, and everyone eating dinner were supposed to be pretend guests. You'd be assigned your role before the game began, along with a backstory, relationships with other characters, and potential motives for the murder. So that evening, couples filed into the resort's grand dining hall, dressed for a night of intrigue. The murder mystery dinner show was titled The Bride Who Cried. As dinner was served, the actors guiding the event played out a dramatic story of a wedding gone horribly wrong. A murder in plain sight, a room full of potential suspects. The pretend groom raised his champagne glass, toasting to his new bride, and then as he took a sip, his face twisted in shock, and then he clutched his throat, and in front of the entire room, he collapsed to the floor, dead. The guests all gasped, and another guest pretended to be a detective, and he rushed forward, declaring, "This man has been murdered." Kim watched, thoroughly entertained, playing along with the other guests. Steve, on the other hand, he remained quiet. Was he truly enjoying himself, or was he just watching Kim and hoping that he had done a great job picking this event? She still felt so distant, but either way, he had no idea that this would be his last meal that he would ever have. In the pretend murder, the reveal came after a lot of back and forth playing along in the game. It was the bride's mother who had killed the groom. She had poisoned him. She slipped it into his drink. Her motive was one that was deep and twisted. A love for her daughter, this protective instinct. She wanted to get rid of him before he could ruin her daughter. That's pretty evil.
Reminds me of Donna Adelson.
It does, actually.
After dinner, it was back to real life. Kim and Steve returned to the room, winding down for the night. They were exhausted and ready to relax. It was already late, about 11:30 p.m. The TV flickered, playing the movie Tommy Boy as the couple drifted off to sleep. Harbortown Golf Resort was calm, and the guests were asleep in their beds. But then, around 1:15 a.m., everything changed. A 911 call shattered the silence. The voice on the other end was shaky. A woman said there was a fire in her room. It was Hricko on the phone, but she was also in motion. She was in her car, speeding toward the main lobby while simultaneously speaking with the dispatcher who was attempting to get clear details. What was going on? Kim tried to explain that there was a fire in her hotel room and her husband was still inside. The dispatcher, still trying to gather information, was asking questions like, "Where is your husband? What room number?" By the time Kim parked directly in front of the lobby, she was still holding her phone in hand. She flung open the door and rushed inside, going right up to the front desk and telling them that there was a fire. The commotion caught the attention of Philip Parker, a guest who was in the lobby. He turned toward Kim, quickly assessing the situation. "What room?" Philip said. For a split second, she seemed unsure, and Philip pressed again. "What's your name?"
This time, Kim answered and even spelled it out because their last name is kind of unique. Even though it's Hricko, it's spelled with an H. So Kim answered, and then Philip repeated the information to the front desk, and the staff confirmed that Kim and her husband Steve were in room 506. Now, we told you a little bit about this, but we're telling more details at this point. Now, Philip took off running, and by the time he got to the building, there was a thin column of smoke coming out of the back of the structure. Philip wasted no time. He was running towards the doors and knocking on them, trying to wake up other guests. And then that's when he saw that the smoke was coming from the back of Steve and Kim's room, right through a crack in the sliding patio door. Philip dropped to his knees, trying to get inside. His eyes were watering from the heat, and his cousin, who was running behind him, grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall, and he smashed the glass door, breaking through the barrier. Philip crawled inside, and there, lying on the floor between the two beds, was a man's body. It was Steve Hricko. He was motionless. The skin on his face and head appeared to be charred. The surrounding floor was still warm with embers, and Philip moved quickly, pressing his hands against Steve's chest, trying to revive him. But there was no response. He grabbed Steve by the feet, he dragged him towards the sliding glass door, and with his cousin's help, they pulled him onto the back deck. But as the fresh air hit Steve's lifeless form, one thing became very clear. Steve was already gone.
The first St. Michael's police officers on scene were Officer Patrick Sally and Officer Stephen Craig. As they reached the back of the resort, they immediately saw Steve's body lying on the deck. His arms were extended to his side, his torso was exposed, his blue pajama pants pulled down, a partially burnt t-shirt still clinging to his chest. His upper body was burned. One of the officers knelt beside him, feeling for a pulse, and there was nothing. Officer Sally stepped into the room, moving around cautiously. Here were his initial observings. The room had 2 double beds, positioned side by side with a nightstand in between. The bed on the right, nearest to the bathroom, was completely burned through, the metal springs exposed. The headboard on the right side of the bed nearest of the side table was charred. The carpet below had even melted. There was a wood-burning stove in the corner, the metallic stove containing the remains of an easy light log wrapper. Warm embers were inside.
It's weird because the bed, it is on the right, but when you're looking at it, the soot is on the left. So I just wanted to, like the whole bed, because some people aren't watching, they're on Spotify or other areas, but they're like, the whole bed is totally burned. And then if you're looking straight at the headboard, the left side would be burned, but it's really the right side of the bed, right near the side table.
Soot covered large sections of the walls and furniture. However, the carpet was not extensively burned, and the windows were blackened by the smoke rather than direct flame. And there were a pack of backwoods mild and natural cigars nearby, with one cigar missing. A few empty beer bottles littered the room, as well as a Diet Pepsi bottle that was slightly melted on the side right table next to some dollar bills that were untouched. It was really only one portion of the room that sustained the fire damage.
Yeah, and something that was interesting that you just pointed out was that there were dollar bills that were not burned. This Pepsi bottle that was kind of like crinkled on one side, like you could tell the heat kind of melted it in. Just listen to those things and just remember the details of the room. The smoke damage was extensive, but the fire hadn't spread as much as this officer would have expected. So what stopped it? Wouldn't the flames have consumed more of the room, he thought? And this thought lingered as firefighters from St. Michael's Fire Department arrived on scene. They moved quickly, securing the area, helping to evacuate other guests as officers tried to make sense of what they were seeing. And then came Kim. She approached the officers. Her voice was high-pitched, her steps were unsteady, and the first thing out of her mouth, "I want to see the body." The thing was, no one had told her that Steve was dead yet.
Kim was taken aside, given time to compose herself. She appeared hysterical and despondent, unable to stand without assistance. The officer helped her into the back of the patrol car and then brought her to the room 1016 in the main building while the first responders were working on her husband. Kim was still in shock, asking Officer Craig to call Steve's best friend, Mike Miller, and he did. After several minutes, Kim lay down on the bed and fell asleep.
Could you fall asleep if you knew that people were like working on your husband trying to revive him? But then she's like, "Where is the body?" It's kind of strange.
Maybe if you're in so much shock, all you can do is sleep. I'm not sure. Probably not, though. I wouldn't be able to sleep. A few minutes later, she woke up and started asking about her husband's condition. State Police Trooper Clay Hartness arrived on the scene and confirmed that Steve had died. The state police then took over the investigation, and Trooper Hartness contacted Father Paul Jennings, the state police chaplain, and they went to room 1016 to notify Kim.
Upon hearing the news, Kim sobbed and she moaned, but there was no significant emotional outburst. Was this a red flag? Or was this like the everyone grieves differently type of thing? I don't know. As dawn approached on February 15th, authorities transitioned from emergency response to a more formal investigation. They roped off room 506 and started documenting everything. They were photographing burn patterns, collecting personal items, and speaking with potential witnesses. They also planned to interview Kim more thoroughly once she was more stable. In these early hours, it was standard procedure to treat any hotel room fire resulting in a fatality with caution, ensuring that no detail was overlooked.
Outside, guests who had been evacuated returned to their rooms once firefighters confirmed that there was no further threat. Philip Parker, who had attempted to rescue Steve, spoke briefly with officers, explaining how he had found the body and dragged it onto the deck. Other hotel patrons gave statements about hearing a commotion in the hallway. Some mentioned that they hadn't heard Kim knocking, but rather a man's voice shouting to get out. The positioning of Steve's body when he had been found was a bit interesting. He wasn't near the door as if he tried to escape. He was lying neatly between the beds. His pajama pants were pulled down all the way past his private parts. This didn't happen when he was being pulled to the deck. They were like that when Philip arrived, and the fire had not destroyed the lower half part of his body, which meant they had been pulled down before the fire started. And then there was the Playboy magazine. It was found next to him, partially burned. It was on top of an unburned pillow that was found near the point of the fire's origin. The magazine was open to a page featuring an unclothed woman.
Right. So his pants were pulled down. He's not on the bed that it was completely burned. He's like between the bed. And Philip was just letting the officers know, like, oh, yeah, we found him with his pants all the way down like that. And it really appeared from the beer bottles, the cigar, the positioning of Steve's pants, and this magazine that he was enjoying a cigar in bed, looking at this naughty mag with his pants down, and he passed out and he rolled out of bed and this started a fire. So it's tragic, but then they were thinking, why on a romantic trip with his wife? That's why they really wanted to speak to Kim to understand what in the world was going on. So let's jump back real fast and then we'll backtrack. The morning after the fire, smoke is still clinging to the air, and the once bustling Valentine's retreat now felt eerily quiet. The guests had checked out early. They were whispering about this tragedy in room 506, their romantic weekend tainted by the news that a man had died in his bed while his wife ran for help. A little after 5 a.m., Sergeant Karen Alt, Corporal Keith Elsie, and the Deputy Fire Marshal went to room 1016 to speak with Kim, who had just woken up. Throughout the interview, Kim sobbed and she held a damp towel to her mouth, seeming like she's very overwhelmed. Kim explained that the weekend getaway had been a surprise. It was planned by Steve and his childhood friend Mike, and she wasn't exactly aware of any of the details until she and Steve arrived. She described how Steve had been under immense pressure at work, and the stress was straining their marriage. This trip, she said, was meant to help them reconnect. That evening, after they returned to the room following the murder mystery show, she had built a fire in the wood stove using the log provided by the hotel, hoping to take the chill out of the room. She made coffee and then she stretched out on one of the beds with a newspaper while Steve popped open that complimentary bottle of champagne. Now, Kim admitted she wasn't a fan of it. She thought it was too cheap, but Steve did drink his glass.
Kim explained to the officers that they hadn't eaten all day. Hungry, Steve volunteered to drive to a nearby convenience store and returned with a handful of snacks, 2 hot dogs, tasty cakes, and a soda. While he was gone, Kim unpacked their bags, hanging a pair of wet pants she had washed that morning out on the deck to dry. They had attempted to sit outside for a moment, taking in the view, but the wind and the damp air quickly sent them back inside. Before heading to dinner, Kim recalled Steve took his prescribed Effexor, an antidepressant that he had been on for 2 weeks. His dosage had recently doubled. Alongside it, he routinely took Xanax for anxiety and Flexeril for muscle pain. She noted that he had only packed enough medication for the weekend, rather than bringing the full bottles. Kim said dinner had been a lively affair. She and Steve mingled at their table, drinking as they chatted with other couples. Someone ordered a bottle of wine for the group, and the couple charged another round of drinks to their room. On the way back, they stopped at the cash bar outside of the dining room to grab beers before retreating upstairs.
So is she saying that they drank a lot and he was on meds? Because that's the feeling that I'm getting.
Yeah, it seems like they had at least a few drinks. Once they were in their room, they turned on Tommy Boy. Steve changed into his pajamas. He popped a pinch of chewing tobacco into his lip. It was an old habit, and prepared a Theraflu drink. He had been battling lingering symptoms of strep bronchitis.
He was the last in their family to catch it, and Kim had had it before too. So he's like on all these meds, taking Theraflu, having tobacco in his lip. I mean, she's being so specific about all the things they did, but you would have to be, right?
And they were drinking a lot.
Right.
Kim claimed that something about Steve felt off that night. He seemed intoxicated in a way that she wasn't used to. Normally, even after a few drinks, he held himself together.
Kim also said that she took her meds. She took Zoloft, and she just like got into bed with coffee, which is weird because you would think if you're taking Zoloft, why would you also drink coffee? But okay, I'm just giving you the things that I thought were weird.
I mean, with all this, she said that they were still laughing during the movie, enjoying a rare moment of lightness. But then things got uncomfortable when Steve tried to initiate intimacy. Kim explained that their marriage counselor had advised them to focus on relaxation this weekend, to reconnect emotionally, not physically, and Kim wanted to go with that plan.
It had actually been months since they had been together intimately, and Kim wasn't ready to just jump right back into that. She wanted to follow the counselor's advice, and Steve had already agreed that they would. However, he kept being persistent, and Kim was starting to feel upset, and she refused again and again. And that's when she said the tension in the room shifted. What was a lighthearted night then turned into Kim becoming frustrated and feeling pressured. So she decided to take a breather. She grabbed the keys and she left their room. She explained that she drove aimlessly through Easton, a town that she said she barely knew. And Kim said she'd only been to this hotel once before, 3 years earlier, and this time she slept the entire drive up. She considered driving all the way home, but then decided against it. She was worried about, of course, leaving Steve at this hotel with no car. But her friend Maureen and her husband Mike lived in Easton. Remember, he's actually the superintendent of this resort. So she said she started looking for their house, but as she was looking for Route 50, the main road in Easton, she just kept getting lost and turned around. She even said like all the roads had a 3 in them, and I was really thrown off. So she stopped to ask for directions. And she said that the people she asked just sent her back in the direction of the hotel.
By the time she returned, it was late, and she realized that she had left her room key inside. Not wanting to wake Steve, she remembered that she had left the patio door open. She made her way around the building, and as soon as she opened the door, thick black smoke rushed out. She couldn't see her hand in front of her face. No fire alarms blared, no voices called out, and panic set in. She screamed Steve's name, but got no answer.
Now, she said that she ran down the halls, pounding on the doors because she wanted to wake up other guests. But then when the guests were interviewed, they said they didn't remember hearing that. All they remembered hearing was a man's voice telling them to get out, which was Philip Parker. But then she said she got back into her car, dialed 911. Her hands were shaking so violently that she almost dropped her phone, and she was racing to the lobby, which is not near these actual lodges. You have to drive your car. And then she just left her car out front with the keys still in the ignition. Her engine was still running. And by the time she arrived, the fire had already drawn a crowd. She followed the rush of people back towards the burning unit. And that's when she said she heard a voice over the radio. And it said, "White male, DOA," which means dead on arrival. So that is why she said she demanded to see Steve. She was like clawing through the officers, but they were holding her back. And then she just collapsed into hysterics. She's screaming for her husband. And through sobs, she told the investigators she didn't understand how this could have happened. That Steve hadn't been himself lately, and he was acting very strange. He was doing things that were out of character. And she was surprised that Steve wanted to be intimate with her that night because they had already agreed not to. She mentioned that in the past, when Steve wanted to, get in the mood and get intimate, he would turn to Playboy magazines and other adult material online. So that could explain why the magazine was found in their room.
But let's pause on Kim's interview for a moment, because one of the first people Elsie and Alt spoke to was Mike Miller, Steve's best friend. Someone that knew him really well, better than anyone else. By the time Mike arrived at the resort, the fire was already out and Steve was dead. He had driven from Easton, shaken by the phone call he had received just an hour earlier. At around 1:30 a.m., his wife Maureen had picked up the phone to hear an unfamiliar voice telling her that Steve had been in a fire and that Kim was asking for Mike to come to the resort immediately. The details were vague, but something about the way Maureen's face changed as she listened sent a chill down Mike's back. He threw on clothes and rushed out the door, but as soon as he arrived, nothing felt right. He had expected to find a devastated widow, a woman overcome with grief, but instead, he walked into the hotel room where Kim was moved to and found her lying in bed, curled up on her side, barely acknowledging him.
Well, I mean, she could have been in shock, right? But when he hugged her, she didn't hug him back. She wasn't crying. She didn't ask for details or seem frantic for answers. Instead, after just a few minutes, she closed her eyes and then just went back to sleep. And Mike was just standing there watching her, feeling something he couldn't actually put into words. It was like Kim had just shut down completely. Or worse, like she kind of already knew how this night would end. Like she had been prepared for it, because she's so calm. It's like I said, could you relax if your husband, was in this state of being dead and being revived and you didn't know what was going on? I would be glued to right behind the officers. I'd be like, what is happening? And I wouldn't be able to sleep at all.
As Mike sat with investigators trying to piece together what had happened, the official explanation floating around the resort was that Steve had been drinking, smoking a cigar while looking at his magazine and must have passed out, setting the room on fire. But the second Mike heard that, he felt a wave of disbelief. That wasn't the Steve he knew. He had known Steve since junior high, since they were kids, dreaming about working on golf courses, growing up side by side. And if there was one thing Mike knew for certain, it was that Steve did not smoke cigars. He had never mentioned picking up the habit, never casually smoked one during the night out, but he did chew Skoal tobacco. That was his only vice, according to Mike.
But there are people who only smoke a cigar or a cigarette, maybe when they are drinking or it's a special occasion. But the idea that Steve would have drunkenly fallen asleep with a lit cigar in bed, Mike just could not picture it. Sure, Steve liked a beer every now and then, but he wasn't a heavy drinker, certainly not to the point of being so impaired that he would cause a fire and be unable to wake up. And then there was this Playboy magazine found near his body. Mike just totally shook his head, no way. Steve was not interested in that. He's not, at least not in any way that matched the scenario being presented to him. This whole story, the cigar, the drinking, the magazine, the fire, it felt like it had been designed to paint a picture of this man that was not the Steve that people close to him knew.
Mike's mind drifted back to the last real conversation he had with Steve, just a few days before the trip. Steve had called him, sounding hopeful for the first time in months. He had booked the weekend getaway because he really believed it could rekindle things with Kim. He even called it their first date all over again, a chance to reset, to remember what they had before things fell apart. And now, just days later, Steve was dead. It was devastating. It was cruel. It wasn't fair. But more than that, everything about the way he died contradicted the kind of person that he was. If he had been so determined to save his marriage, why would he ruin the trip by getting heavily intoxicated? Why would he jeopardize everything he had worked toward by recklessly smoking a cigar in bed? And why would he be caught with his pants down reading a dirty magazine?
Especially on a trip with his wife. It just didn't make sense. The math wasn't adding up. And the more Mike thought about it, the more he knew that this was just all wrong. So going back to Kim's interview, when Sergeant Alt brought up that Mike Miller had said that Steve didn't smoke, Kim responded that Steve had been doing a lot of things recently that were out of character. She said, "It's like I've been living with a stranger." And by 8:30 that Sunday morning, Maureen Miller pulled up outside the hotel to pick him up. The ride back to Maureen's house was just completely silent. Kim was just sitting in the passenger seat, staring blankly out the window. She didn't cry. She didn't say anything. She was just there. It was weird. It wasn't until they arrived at the Miller home that Kim finally spoke. She told Maureen about the argument at the hotel between her and Steve, how she stormed out and drove around town trying to find Maureen's house, but getting lost along the way. Maureen thought that didn't quite make sense because Kim had been to her house before, more than once. How could she have gotten lost? And if she was so desperate to find the house, why didn't she just call? And when Maureen actually asked, Kim was just like, Well, I didn't want to bother you in the middle of the night.
Right. If you didn't want to bother in the middle of the night, why go to her house?
Because you're going to have to knock on the door and be like, hi, I'm here. And that's exactly what Maureen was thinking. She's like, I would have had to wake up anyway. So what was the difference? And as Kim spoke, Maureen noticed something very unsettling. Kim wasn't devastated. She wasn't mourning. She wasn't even talking about Steve. Every sentence revolved around herself, how confused she was, how exhausted she felt, how difficult this time was for her. But not once did she express sorrow for her husband's death. And again, was this a red flag or had none of this set in yet?
That afternoon, a grief counselor met Kim at her house, and the purpose was to help Kim and her mother break the devastating news to her 8-year-old daughter, Anna, that her father was dead. They sat the little girl down and gently explained what had happened. The child's reaction was instant, visceral. She screamed, gut-wrenching sobs, a level of raw, unfiltered grief that filled the house. But Kim didn't react.
Right. So her daughter's having a natural reaction. This is the first time she's heard something like this, something so traumatic. And her brain shouldn't even be able to process it as much as an adult. Yet the adult is not reacting.
Do you think Kim was just being strong for Anna?
I thought about that. And I think people around her thought about that too, because you do have to be strong for your child.
It's hard not to think negative thoughts when a person seems so detached.
It's true.
And that night, Maureen stayed with Kim and her daughter, whether it was to provide support or just to keep an eye on Kim. Maureen wasn't entirely sure, but by the next morning, Kim was already making calls. She phoned the morgue, arranging to claim Steve's body. She and Maureen contacted a funeral director, but almost immediately an issue arose. Kim wanted Steve to be cremated. It was an issue because Steve's family was horrified. You see, Steve's family were devout Catholics, and in 1998, cremation was still highly controversial in their faith. While the Catholic Church had started permitting it after 1963, it was still discouraged, viewed as a rejection of the body's sanctity and resurrection. Some dioceses even refused to bury cremated remains in Catholic cemeteries. Steve's family adamantly opposed cremation. They wanted a traditional Catholic burial, the way Steve had been raised.
Yeah, this is a big deal. I mean, it's somebody's belief system. It's his family going against his, the now widow. But Kim would not budge. She claimed that at his grandmother's funeral, where she had just been cremated, Steve had told Kim he approved of cremation, and that's what he wanted for himself. His family refused to believe this. They begged Kim to please reconsider. Can you even imagine? But she wouldn't. Instead, Kim just moved forward. She purchased a cemetery plot and she finalized the funeral service. Since he had to be cremated, and you just mentioned this, he could not be buried in a Catholic cemetery like his family wanted. So he couldn't even be buried in the cemetery that his entire family was going to be buried at. Instead, Kim arranged for him to be interred at the Spring Creek Presbyterian Cemetery in State College. And the family was furious. Their frustration only deepened when they realized that Kim didn't even seem to care about their wishes or the way that they felt. He had 3 sisters who adored him, who loved him and missed him, and they couldn't believe that Kim was putting them through all this. She showed no regard for their grief, and later, while at the funeral home, Maureen turned to Kim and she's like, "Do you have life insurance for Steve? Because this is getting expensive." Kim barely even hesitated. She nodded immediately and told her, "Oh yeah, there's a policy. I know exactly where it is." And Maureen was just sitting there like, that's strange. Most people, including herself, they would have to dig through drawers. They would have to search through folders and look for the paperwork. But Kim, she already knew exactly where it was located. And she even described it. She said that she renewed the policy a few weeks earlier, but had forgotten to put it away, that it was just sitting in a cardboard box in the dining room. Very strange, right? Because Maureen was sitting there thinking, why was Kim reviewing their life insurance policy recently? And who remembers something like that so perfectly? She tried to shake it, but the feeling just lingered. She'd been standing by Kim's side, even though Mike had actually confided in his wife that he had a really bad feeling about Kim. Maureen told him that he was just in shock and he was trying to make sense of a tragic accident that didn't make sense to him. So he's like pointing fingers like, could it be Kim? But Maureen couldn't help feeling like Kim had already been prepared for this moment. And we've heard this a few times now.
And while Kim was busy handling funeral plans, the police were busy with something else. The investigation into Steve's death was far from over.
So let's bring you up to speed about their findings. Less than an hour after the 911 call came in, fire investigator Mike Mulligan arrived to the resort around 2 a.m. He methodically ruled out every logical cause for this fire.
There were no faulty wires, no malfunctioning heaters, no sudden electrical surges that could have sparked the blaze. The hotel's HVAC system was examined. It was completely intact. Lightning wasn't a factor. The weather that night had been clear. With the usual suspects eliminated, Mulligan turned to the one possibility left in the room: a lit cigar. It seemed plausible at first. A forgotten cigar left smoldering on the bed could have easily ignited the fire, but as he combed through the scene, something was missing. There was no cigar butts, no ashes, no burn marks where one might have fallen.
I was thinking, but couldn't it have been burned up? Like, if everything else caught fire, couldn't the cigar just be burned away? That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, could a cigar really ignite the hotel under normal conditions? To find out, he conducted a series of burn tests. He gathered pillows and pillowcases similar to the ones found in the room, then placed lit cigars of the same brand onto the fabric. He watched carefully as they smoldered, testing different positions on the pillowcase, on the pillow itself, even pressing the burning tip into the fibers. But nothing. The fabric wouldn't ignite. Hotels, and I don't know if you didn't know this, but they use fire-resistant bedding, treated with chemicals to prevent exactly from this kind of accident.
I did not know that. And then I was thinking, ew, are those, I don't know why it just sounds like they wouldn't be as quality, but
That's why they always feel kind of plasticky.
now it makes sense to me. I had no idea.
Even after repeated testing, Mulligan couldn't get the bedding to catch fire. The cigars would burn out long before causing any real damage.
And that was it. That was the moment that shattered the theory of the cigar. The fire should not have started this way. Not with an accident, not under normal circumstances, which meant someone had started it. And just like that, the investigation took a much darker turn. Mulligan had seen plenty of accidental fires in his career, but something about this one felt different. The fire had burned in a controlled way, focused primarily on the bed and the upper walls. The carpet nearby, the furniture, and even the windows were intact. There was no signs of a full-blown blaze. The fire had been starved of oxygen, and I couldn't help but think of the Chad Ensel case, when all the doors were closed and the fire couldn't spread.
Next, Mulligan called in a specialized arson dog. His name is Bear. He's a black Labrador trained to detect accelerants. Before sending Bear into the room, Mulligan conducted a control test, dropping a glass vial of evaporated gasoline outside to see if the dog would detect it. Bear immediately alerted to the scent. Then Mulligan led him into room 506, and within seconds, Bear signaled again. Not once, but twice in two distinct locations, on the sliding glass door leading to the deck and between the two beds.
Now that's pretty chilling, because if you're thinking about it, the fire was basically started in those locations. Like, you're not going to be able to get out through the slider and right between the beds where he was found. So the investigator Mulligan pinpointed the fire's point of origin. An accelerant had been used, but why and what kind? These areas would be cut and swabbed for analysis, but ultimately the lab test did not detect any accelerant. And this was because it had probably evaporated by the time the tests were conducted. So they could not definitively prove that it was arson. But the scene became even more strange. Dr. David Fowler was the deputy chief medical examiner for Maryland, and he performed Steve's autopsy. And what he found raised even more questions than answers. One of the most crucial discoveries came from Steve's blood work. His carbon monoxide levels were normal.
For someone who had supposedly died in a fire, this was highly unusual. Typically, fire victims inhale smoke, and as they do, carbon monoxide levels build up in their system, often leading to poisoning. But in Steve's case, his levels were normal. Dr. Fowler even went a step further, examining Steve's airways for soot, a telltale sign of smoke inhalation. If Steve had been breathing while the fire raged, his trachea should have been lined with soot. But when Dr. Fowler looked inside, there was nothing. No soot, no burns, just a thin layer of mucus. That mucus served as a crucial function. It was the body's natural defense mechanism, trapping foreign particles like soot before they have a chance to enter the lungs. If Steve had been alive, even for a few moments after the fire started, soot would have been there. It wasn't. The only logical conclusion was that Steve was already dead before the fire began, and the autopsy didn't stop there.
Toxicology reports revealed there was no alcohol in his system.
Wow.
Despite Kim's claims that he was highly intoxicated on that night and acting strangely, the more evidence stacked up, the clearer the picture became. Steve Hricko had not died from smoke inhalation. Steve Hricko had not died from alcohol poisoning. Steve Hricko had been murdered.
Just a few days later, Steve's funeral was held. And just an hour before the service, news broke. Steve's death was now being investigated as a homicide. Hard Copy, a sensationalist tabloid that often covered high-profile and salacious cases, had already latched onto the story, sensing scandal in the air.
Of course they did. Steve's mysterious death fit their formula perfectly. A romantic getaway gone wrong.
A fire under suspicious circumstances.
And to top it all off, the couple had attended a Valentine's Day murder mystery dinner just before Steve died. A barrage of reporters waited eagerly, their lenses zoomed in, their microphones were ready. It was almost too perfect for the headlines, and the world was just hungry for answers. The moment Maureen Miller heard this, she was furious. This was her best friend. She grabbed the phone and she called the news outlets directly. She wanted to know, where did you get this information? And their answer, the Maryland State Police. So Maureen immediately called the police and she demanded details, but they refused to say anything. And you know why? Because she was also a suspect at this time. We'll get into some of that later. She was so frustrated, but she got inside her car to go pick up Kim and they headed to the funeral together.
And inside the funeral home, 2 rooms had been prepared. One was filled with flowers and framed photos of Steve, and the other held his casket. Kim walked in and barely acknowledged the casket. She didn't pause, didn't cry, but instead, she casually scanned the bouquets, flipping through the cards. And it wasn't until she knelt beside Steve's casket that she finally broke down. Friends and family arrived one by one, sharing memories of Steve. They spoke of his humor, his kindness, the life he had built, and Steve's lifelong friend, Mike Miller, was meant to give the final tribute. But when he stepped forward, grief overtook him. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Overwhelmed, he stepped back silently. And while inside the funeral home, people mourned, outside another crowd had gathered. Steve's burial service was held at the funeral home, but not at a church, because his cremation, as we said earlier, made a traditional Catholic service impossible. The moment was supposed to be intimate, solemn, and a final goodbye, but instead it felt like a media circus.
And once again, I told you that the reporters were there, and Hard Copy, that was like a really big...
I remember Hard Copy.
They were just lurking nearby. They were even staking out the cemetery, very rude, and they were just eager to capture anything, like footage of the grieving family. And of course, tensions were running high. Kim's brother, Matt, he just snapped. He almost punched a cameraman in the face who had been following them around. And finally, the reporters left, and Steve was interred at Spring Creek Presbyterian Cemetery, his final resting place, chosen against the wishes of his entire family. And as his ashes were laid to rest, the rift between Kim and Steve's loved ones grew even deeper because, to them, her behavior continued to raise red flags. After the burial, friends and family gathered for the reception, and it was meant to be a time for comfort and reflection and mourning. But Kim, the moment she walked in, she goes straight for the food trays. She's like popping open the lids. She's eating the meat and cheese with her hands. It's kind of weird. Maureen was just watching and she was stunned. They had just buried her husband. The grief was still in the air. It was just very awkward. And it just seemed that Kim was distracted or preoccupied. When Maureen gently commented on it, Kim just gave a quick excuse. She was just anxious.
And that night, back at the Miller's home, Maureen sat quietly, replaying the day's events in her mind. The funeral, the cemetery, the reception. Kim never seemed to settle into grief the way that everyone else had. Something about her demeanor felt wrong. And Maureen couldn't shake it. The day after Steve's funeral, Kim made an unusual request. She asked Maureen, "Will you come to the mall with me?" And Kim had apparently broken a nail. Maureen assumed that it would be a quick errand.
Right. And to me, I was just thinking, like, why not just pop all your other nails off? Your husband just died. Like, why are you thinking about your broken nail? When they got to the nail salon, Maureen quickly realized it wasn't just one nail. Kim had a whole full manicure planned. And she was just casually chatting with the nail tech as if nothing had happened, as if she didn't just bury her husband. And as Maureen sat there watching Kim laugh and gossip and focus entirely on herself, she got this sick feeling in her stomach. And I think any of us would. Had Kim even processed what happened, she thought, you could be in shock and taking your mind off it. Some people go right back to work after a loved one has been killed or died because they want to get their mind off of it. But again, Maureen was like, does she even care?
While Kim was getting her nails done, others were going to the police. Rachel McCoy, one of Kim's close friends, had been uneasy from the very beginning. One day after Steve's death, she decided she couldn't stay silent. She reached out to Corporal Keith Elsie of the state police, setting up a meeting for her on Tuesday, February 17th at 11 a.m. Rachel wasn't alone in her suspicions. Jenny Gowen, another coworker, also spoke to investigators. She had listened to Kim vent about her marriage for months, but until recently, Kim had always made it sound like things were manageable, but that had changed. Lately, Kim's complaints had become harsher, even colder. She called Steve pathetic. She mocked him, saying if they got a divorce, he wouldn't survive without her.
Looks like people are starting to break down because another coworker, Norma, also contacted the police. Kim had confided in her about her affair. That's right. Kim had met someone. His name was Brad Winkler. We already know that Kim wasn't happy in her marriage. She felt trapped. She felt like she was living a lie, but she also wasn't sure she wanted to throw away 10 years with Steve. Norma had told her to end the affair until she figured out what she truly wanted, but Kim seemed unable or unwilling to make a decision. But now with Steve gone, it looked like she finally had. This wasn't a tragic love story. This was a slow-burning disaster, one that Kim had been planning to escape for months. And on Valentine's Day weekend, she finally saw her way out.
Let's go back to November of 1997, just a couple months before Steve would be dead. One day, out of the blue, Kim reached out to Maureen Miller, and at this point, they hadn't spoken for a while. Kim told her she was planning a trip to Easton, where Mike and Maureen had just moved, and Kim wanted to catch up. Maureen knew her husband Mike would be out of town for work, taking the kids with them. It seemed like the perfect chance for a girls' weekend. Maureen was excited, but she had no idea that Kim's trip had nothing to do with her. It had everything to do with someone else, her coworker and closest friend from the hospital, Jenny.
Exactly. Jenny was set to marry Sean Gowen on November 29th, and she was having this big bachelorette party in Easton that weekend. And Kim had no intention of missing this pre-wedding celebration. She hadn't come to see Maureen, but she didn't want to attend the party all alone. So Maureen was kind of like her wing woman, and Kim's visit to Easton started off innocently enough. It was just a weekend of drinks, laughs, and catching up. But that night, at a beach party thrown in Jenny's honor, a new guest arrived, the groom's cousin, Brad Winkler, a 22-year-old Marine, fresh out of a messy divorce, still angry and still hurt, still reeling from the wife who had cheated on him and thrown him away. He was young, handsome, and reckless, looking for fun. And when he sat down next to Kim, their worlds collided. He told her his story, a 6-month marriage that had ended in betrayal, a woman who had walked all over him. And as he spoke, Kim saw herself in his pain. She leaned in, she listened, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a rush of excitement, of desire, of possibility. And that night, as the waves crashed along the shore, she made a decision. Her marriage was already over. Now she just needed a way out. And for the first time, she let herself wonder, what if Steve was gone? That night, Jenny had asked Kim to help with some last-minute wedding preparations, and Brad, being the cousin of the groom, he was roped in too. That weekend, they found themselves running errands together, setting up decorations, and handling the chaos of wedding logistics. But somewhere in between, arranging floral centerpieces and making supply runs, something else happened. Something neither of them could ignore. They worked well together. Brad made Kim laugh in a way she hadn't in years. She touched his arm a little too often. They moved in sync, like they'd been doing this for a lifetime. And every moment they spent together, the tension grew thicker. There was no denying it anymore. By the end of the weekend, they weren't just two people running wedding errands. They were two people who wanted each other, two people who had already crossed an invisible line. And once you cross that line, there's no turning back. But back home, Steve had no idea that his wife was falling for another man. He was too busy battling his own demons. By late 1997, Steve had been struggling with depression. That's when he started going on those meds and meeting with his counselor. The pressures of his career setbacks, his crumbling marriage, and his wife's constant rejection had taken a toll on him. And in an effort to regain control, that is why he asked his doctor to put him on those meds. He was taking them as directed, but Kim, she was quick to use that against him. Of course she would, right? He's trying hard, and she told his friends that Steve wasn't himself anymore, that he had become moody, irrational, unpredictable, that he was weak. She planted seeds of doubt in those around her, portraying herself as a woman trapped with a husband who was slipping into something dangerous.
But Steve wasn't unstable. He was just desperate to fix something that was already broken beyond repair. After that weekend with Brad, Kim couldn't stop thinking about him. She felt alive again, excited. She felt wanted. And when she went home to Steve, it only made her hate her life more. She didn't see the devoted father who adored his daughter. She didn't see the man who still looked at her like she was the center of his world. All she saw was a roadblock, a man who was standing in the way of a life that she wanted. And that is when the plan began to form.
It started small at first. It was a whisper in the back of her mind, a thought that she would just push away, only for it to return stronger. She began talking about it aloud, testing the water, seeing how people reacted. She told her coworkers, "If I knew I could kill him and get away with it, I would." They laughed, brushing it off as Kim being dramatic. But Kim wasn't joking. She started doing research, quietly and carefully. And by now, Sergeant Karen Alt had heard enough. Kim's comments to friends were very troubling, but they were just that. They were just comments. But now she was focused on talking to more and more people close to Kim.
Next, she sat down with Terry Armstrong, a former neighbor who had known Kim and Steve for 2 years. When asked about the couple, Terry hesitated, but then shared a conversation that had haunted her. It happened around New Year's, just weeks before Steve's death. That night, Kim had vented to her about her marriage. She told Terry that she was planning to ask Steve for a divorce. Not only that, she admitted that she had been seeing Brad, but insisted it was just casual and all they had done was kiss. Then Kim's tone shifted. She got worried that once she asked Steve for a divorce, he would try to take their daughter from her. She said she wasn't going to let that happen. Terry tried to reassure that she didn't think Steve would go that far.
But Kim just wouldn't let it go. And then she said something that really frightened Terry. Kim admitted that she'd been thinking about ways to kill her husband. Not out of rage, not because she was scared of him, but to collect insurance money so that their daughter would be financially set for life. Terry just sat in silence. She was stunned. Had Kim just said that out loud? And she did. And she kept talking. The conversation took another turn, and Kim unloaded on Terry, feeding her negative information about Steve. Some of it was really personal. She complained about his upbringing, about his parents, and their so-called permissive attitude towards nudie magazines. She seemed to have a real issue with that, by the way. She claimed that once she came home from a trip to find explicit magazines scattered across their home, and worse, she said she found even more images on their computer. But what infuriated her the most was this vintage Playboy magazine collection that Steve had inherited from his father. Coming from a religious background, Kim said she was repulsed. She told Steve in no uncertain terms, "If I ever find another magazine like this in our home, our marriage is over."
And yet, as fierce as she sounded, it wasn't just the magazines that seemed to bother her. Kim went on to criticize Steve's sex life, his preferences, his habits, his timing. She claimed that he only wanted intimacy in the mornings and when he felt like it, leaving her feeling rejected and ignored at night. Terry just sat there, listening, stunned.
I mean, if you're really trying to work on your marriage, what does it matter if it's day or night? It's all about her.
Right. Terry thought that was kind of odd. Kim had never mentioned issues with her sex life before, and now suddenly she was spilling these intensely personal grievances, as if rewriting their entire marriage.
And why would you be sharing this stuff?
I have no idea.
I have an idea.
Well, something about it didn't sit right.
She was painting him in a way that wasn't true. On purpose. She's planting all these seeds, oh, he's weird and he's on meds and, our intimacy isn't good.
Right, I see what you're saying.
And everyone's like, wait, that's not the person I know. About a month before his death, Terry found herself at the Hricko household one evening while Kim was not there. And that's when she had a 90-minute conversation with Steve. They were standing in the kitchen, and for the first time, Terry saw a different side of him. Steve seemed nervous, he was emotional, and at one point, he actually started crying. So something was going wrong, right? His voice was shaking, and he confessed how much he loved Kim and their daughter. That makes me really sad. He didn't want to lose them, and he was trying to be better. He'd been seeing a psychologist. He had started taking antidepressants. He was doing everything he could to keep his family together, but he seemed genuinely afraid that it wasn't enough. And that night, after Steve went to bed, Terry spoke to Kim, and she told her how heartbroken Steve seemed, how much he still wanted the marriage to work, and Kim barely acknowledged it. Terry said she wasn't interested in what Steve had to say or how he felt. And now looking back, Terry couldn't shake the feeling that Kim had already made up her mind, and she was going to take matters into her own hands.
Now, Detective Keith Elsie was also interviewing friends of Kim's, and he spoke to Rachel McCoy. She'd known Kim the longest. By 1997, Kim and Rachel spoke 3 times a week, went shopping together, and dined out together on a regular basis. Rachel said one day while the two were shopping, their conversation took a dark yet playful turn. The two women joked about the idea of tying their husbands up, stuffing them into the back of their car, and driving them off a cliff.
I'm sorry, but I have never, ever joked about that with a friend. Like, how is that playfully joking? Like, oh, let's tie our husbands up and throw them off a cliff.
I don't know, but I remember, we having a bunch of friends that had divorcee parties and stuff like that.
Yeah, they do.
We've heard so many of those kind of jokes.
My husband. Yeah, you're right. I have heard that. But that's when Kim's tone shifted. They were sitting there being playful, but then she sounded indifferent. And she said, things would be so much easier if Steve were not around. Rachel, of course, laughed it off, but later she was wondering why she hadn't taken it more seriously. But it's probably because your best friend isn't going to be thinking that you're for real about killing your husband.
It still seems as though Kim was testing the waters with those closest to her, seeing how they felt when she made those comments. Would they laugh? Would they agree? Would they tell her it was a good idea? As the weeks went on, Kim got bolder and bolder with her comments and confession.
And she took it one step further. She actually approached a hospital coworker named Ken Burgess, and she asked, do you know anyone who could take care of my husband? I'll pay $50,000. And Ken was thinking that she was just being funny. And he said, you don't need anyone to kill your husband. There's enough drugs in this operating room. You could just put him to sleep yourself. But when Ken turned around and realized that Kim looked serious, he looked at her like she was crazy. Sensing that he was uncomfortable, Kim just laughed and said, oh, come on. I'm just kidding. But Ken thought she wasn't. He didn't report the incident until February 19th when he read an article in the Washington Post about Steve's death. So now it's clear. Kim got this idea in her head. The idea about putting Steve to sleep.
Also, her friend Norma told the sergeant that Kim had confided in her about taking out a $250,000 life insurance policy on Steve, one with a specific clause targeting smokers. But there was one big problem. Steve wasn't a smoker. The more Norma thought about it, the stranger it seemed, and now it started to make sense. Even Jenny said that Kim openly spoke about how Steve needed to die. And she even said she would have told Steve about her affair with Brad to make him angry enough to take his own life.
Can you imagine that? She's like, oh, I hope, I make him so angry they just offs himself. That's pathetic. That's disgusting.
But she did dismiss the idea because she said it wouldn't make her happy because she wouldn't be able to collect on his life insurance.
Yikes. And can you imagine being the friend listening to this? Am I the only one thinking if I heard my best friend say something like that, I'd, first of all, have to talk some reason into them, right? And then I could probably see myself going to the police. I mean, that doesn't make me a bad friend, right? Because I know people joke, like, I'd help my best friend hide the body. But I'm trying to say that it just sounds suspicious. It's weird.
Everyone's a friend until they're not, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you say things like, oh, I got your back. And it's like, not if you killed someone.
But who actually thinks their friend is serious?
And see, that's the only explanation that makes sense, is that they would be joking, that they would just be saying that stuff. Like, no one actually thinks they're being serious. But I feel like if someone's repeating it over and over again, it's not a joke anymore.
Right.
And let's not forget, This was coupled with her telling all of her friends how she was miserable and unhappy, and she's cheating, and she's getting life insurance, and she doesn't love her husband anymore. It's like, yeah, I think it's a little more than a joke at this point. And speaking of best friends, Kim's friend Rachel, which we told you she's known the longest, had much more to say. Back on January 10th, so just a month before their trip to the resort, Kim was desperate to reach Rachel. She left several frantic messages. Her voice was anxious and urgent, and when they finally connected, Kim begged Rachel to meet her in person. And she immediately did. She drove to Kim's house, arriving around 11:30. I mean, that's a good friend. The moment she stepped inside, she could tell that something was wrong. Kim was visibly distressed. Her movements were tense. Her eyes were restless. There was a drink in her hand that was half finished. She could tell she was intoxicated. Kim explained that Steve was asleep upstairs and that their daughter was staying with a friend, and Kim dropped a bombshell. She says to Rachel that she came up with a plan, a way to kill Steve and make it look like an accident.
Oh, what? The perfect murder?
I mean, that's what they always think, right? Kim then spelled it out for Rachel. She said she had access to a drug that could paralyze Steve's muscles, stop his breathing, and leave no trace on toxicology reports. She didn't have the name of the drug, but she said that she would use this drug on Steve by injecting him with it and then set the house on fire. By the time the authorities arrived, it would look like Steve just died in the blaze. Sound familiar? Rachel's stomach turned. This wasn't some frustrated wife venting about her marriage. Kim sounded serious. Rachel tried to talk her down like I said a good friend would. She asked, how would the fire even work? Steve doesn't smoke. Wouldn't that look suspicious? And the drug, where would you even get something like that? Rachel also pointed out the obvious risks, like what if the fire spread? What if it burned down the entire building and then their neighbors and then killed innocent people? But Kim already had an answer. She insisted she could easily get the drug from work. It was used in trauma cases to paralyze patients for intubation, and it was undetectable in the bloodstream. We'll discuss more about that later.
But what about the fire?
Right, so Kim said it wouldn't spread because her reasoning was that there were always people awake on her street, so someone would call 911 before it got out of control.
Sitting across from Kim, Rachel felt sick. She had never been more afraid of her friend. This wasn't just talk. Kim had thought through every detail. She was actually going to do it. Rachel admitted to Detective Elsie that she was terrified after hearing Kim's plan that she called her neighbors from Kim's house, desperate for support and an escape.
By 3 a.m., she'd had enough. She was shaken and she left Kim's house and her mind was still racing. And the next morning, Rachel called Kim again. She needed to know, are you going to go through with it? And Kim's answer was, I'm not sure, which was very unsettling because it wasn't a no. And what are the chances that she's been planning to kill him this way? And then that's exactly how he died, in a fire, but not in a fire. Wow. And it is too bad that her friend didn't come to police before Steve died.
I mean, you hear this all the time with certain cases, like, because you didn't do anything, it's all talk until you do it.
Right.
Like, why would the cops can't do anything anyways?
Right. Like, my friend is saying that she's going to kill her husband. Okay.
All right, thanks. We'll make a report. Thanks for stopping by. On February 15th, the day following Steve's death, Kim left a voicemail for Rachel, her voice urgent. She said, call me back immediately. When Rachel returned the call, it wasn't Kim who answered. It was Maureen Miller, and she delivered the news that made Rachel's jaw drop. Steve was dead. Kim later reached out to Rachel directly, asking her to come be with her. But this time, Rachel refused. She wanted no part of this. She felt she knew the truth. Kim hadn't just been venting about her marriage. She had been seeking approval for a murder. But just to do his due diligence, Detective Elsie tracked down Rachel's neighbor who confirmed that Rachel had been terrified the night of January 10th at midnight. Rachel had called her from Kim's house and they said her voice was shaking. She told them everything. Now Steve was dead.
Right. So they confirmed, like, this wasn't a lie. And why would she lie about it anyway? But the neighbor's like, oh yeah, we got that call. She told us that this woman was planning to kill her husband. As surgical technicians, both Jenny and Kim had regular access to a wide range of powerful drugs, especially anesthetics, which were stocked in the operating room for surgeries. The detective spoke with Jenny again, and she admitted to that fact. And she also noticed something troubling about Kim's interest in those drugs. She wasn't just curious. She was fixated. One day, Kim brought up sodium pentanol, a barbiturate commonly used as a sedative and anesthetic. Jenny didn't think much of it at first, but then Kim took it further. She started asking about something far more dangerous, succinylcholine. I told you we would talk more about this later. Well, that's now. Succinylcholine is a powerful paralytic agent used in medical settings, typically to immobilize patients during intubation. Kim wanted to know specifics about how it worked. How fast did it act? In seconds. How long did it last? Well, it depends on the dosage. What would happen in higher doses? Total paralysis, including the muscles needed to breathe. Jenny explained that succinylcholine worked by blocking the neurotransmitter that allows muscles to move. It essentially freezes the body in place, but they're completely aware, but they're unable to move, unable to call for help. And in a high enough dose, it would stop a person from breathing. How scary is that? A victim wouldn't lose consciousness right away. They would be fully aware of everything that was going on as they slowly suffocated to death. They would be suffering. And I thought about this when we were talking about it. He mentioned something and I said, it's almost like what you get in a C-section because you are paralyzed essentially from the neck down, but you're fully aware of everything that's happening in the room, but you can't move.
Creepy.
It is.
That's when Kim let something slip. That's when she started thinking about using succinylcholine as a method to kill Steve. Jenny was horrified. But Kim wasn't done. At one point, she begged Jenny for something unusual. She wanted unconditional love, implying that someone could kill another person and still be lovable, as long as they had people who supported them.
She's like, I'm about to kill my husband, and you're one of my best friends. Like,
Do you still love me?
Yeah, you're still going to love me, right?
Jenny didn't know what to think, but that wasn't just hypothetical curiosity. Kim was thinking about murder, and she was looking for friends who wouldn't turn away when she did it.
She wanted to justify it, and she wanted others to accept it. And after speaking with both Ken Burgess, who was the one who jokingly mentioned the drugs, and Jenny, who said Kim told her she was going to use said drugs, and the specific one that Kim intended to use, Detective Ulsey reached out to Dr. David Fowler. Remember, he was the chief medical examiner that conducted Steve's autopsy. He was going with the theory that Steve had been poisoned by succinylcholine. Dr. Fowler, an expert in forensic pathology, explained that if Steve had been injected with the drug, it would explain why he was already dead before the fire started. Dr. Fowler agreed to run specific tests that would look for the presence of succinylcholine. Luckily, there were still samples of Steve's urine and tissue available since the cause of death had not been officially reported yet, though he had already been cremated.
These samples were quickly shipped to the FBI's toxicology lab, one of the few facilities with the technology capable of detecting trace amounts of succinylcholine.
But there was a problem. It is notoriously difficult to detect in post-mortem examinations. Once inside the body, it breaks down almost instantly into two compounds.
Let me guess, succinate and choline.
Right, because that's in the name, both of which occur naturally in the human body. And within minutes, the drug would disappear without a trace.
Both the medical examiner's office and the FBI toxicologist knew that this was a long shot. After exhaustive testing, their fears were confirmed. There was no trace of succinylcholine. And interestingly, because this pathologist was so thorough, he had already suspected that Steve could have been injected with something. So, before he was cremated, this doctor looked all over his body for a visible injection site. But remember, some of his body was burned. However, what he could see, there was no physical evidence of a needle mark. There was no way to conclusively prove that Steve had been poisoned.
He did everything. He was already looking for signs of this from before because he had suspicions. Even though succinylcholine remained the strongest theory, but it was just a theory. They might never be able to prove it, but the case wasn't over. But the lack of forensic evidence meant investigators had to rely on something else. Kim's own words. They already heard a lot of them through other people, but wouldn't it be great if they could hear it straight from her mouth? The investigators approached Ken Burgess with a bold request. Would he be willing to make a recorded call to Kim and attempt to get her to admit that she had asked him to get rid of Steve? Ken agreed without 1 minute of hesitation.
In Maryland, only one party's consent is required to legally record a conversation, meaning Kim wouldn't have to know. That night, they recorded 3 separate phone calls between Ken and Kim. At 9:14 p.m., Ken placed the first call. Kim answered, but quickly cut the conversation short. She was tucking her daughter into bed and asked to call him back. At 9:22, Ken dialed again. This time, Kim lingered on the phone. They chatted briefly about work, but soon she let her guard down. She admitted she had been crying for days and felt completely numb. She described how in January she had given Steve an ultimatum, change or leave. The tension between them had grown so severe that they had even started separate counseling. Then Ken brought up the past. Before you left Holy Cross, you asked me if I knew anyone who could take Steve out. There was a moment of silence. Then Kim laughed it away, claiming that she had been joking. Ken didn't let it go. He had told her how he read about Steve's death in the newspaper and his stomach dropped. He had been genuinely terrified.
But of course, Kim reassured him that she was just venting. She didn't mean anything by it. It was just talk. Ken then asked a pointed question. What do you want me to say if the police come asking about it? And Kim dismissed his concerns. She assured him again that her earlier words meant nothing. They were just harmless frustration. She told Ken she was devastated over her husband's death. She revealed that she was on 24-hour watch so she wouldn't hurt herself because of the emotional toll. She pleaded with Ken, saying, please don't think that I would be capable of something like that. The worst part would be if people who knew me actually believed I could do that. Despite everything, she insisted that she wished she could have said goodbye to Steve. And then, as if trying to close the subject for good, Kim confidently claimed that the police were actually wrapping up their investigation.
At 11:15 p.m., Kim sent Ken a page. He immediately alerted the police. They instructed him to call her back so that they could record the conversation. At 11:57 p.m., Ken dialed again. They talked for 15 minutes. This time, Kim sounded unsettled. She admitted that their earlier conversation had shaken her. Ken pressed harder. You sounded so serious that day. He reminded her, you really wanted to find someone. He asked her if she told anyone else about their conversations. Kim stuck to her story. They had been joking, nothing more, but Ken wasn't convinced. If you were kidding, then why did you mention money? She repeated that that was just her way of venting. Then she threw in a subtle dig.
She said, I mean, you're not an intimidating guy. If I really wanted Steve dead, don't you think I could have found someone a little more shady? To Ken, this didn't seem like Kim denying involvement. She was making it sound like she had options. As the conversation came to a close, Kim's tone shifted again. She complained about the media attention, saying it had turned her life into a nightmare. People magazine wouldn't leave her alone. The press was hounding her nonstop, and she knew exactly where to place the blame. The Valentine's Day murder mystery dinner. It had turned into a sensational headline, but despite everything, she was certain of one thing. She told Ken, the police believe me, and she sounded sure of it. The investigators listening to the call, they weren't. And that's because they're sitting there still investigating. And she's like, oh, they're done. They're done with their investigation. They're wrapping it up. They don't want to suspect me.
By February 21st, the investigation into Steve Hricko's death was intensifying, but Kim seemed more concerned with appearances than answers. That day, Detective Keith Elsey's phone rang. It was Kim. She wasn't calling in grief or to ask about Steve. She wanted updates on the investigation.
More specifically, she wanted to know if there was anything new in the medical examiner's report. And then she shifted the conversation. Kim complained about being harassed by the media, especially hard copy, and they'd been circling her like vultures ever since Steve's death.
Then came the strangest request of all. Kim wanted to revisit room 506, the very room where her husband had died. Detective Elsey kept his tone neutral. He told Kim that there was no new information to share. None they were willing to share with her anyways.
But there was one thing he did have. He had Steve's wedding band. It had been recovered by the medical examiner during the autopsy, and it was now in police custody. He suggested a meeting at the Easton Police Barracks on February 23rd where she could pick up the ring. And after that, he said they could return to the hotel together. That afternoon at 4:20 p.m., Kim arrived at the Easton Barracks and Elsey handed her Steve's wedding band, and she took it without even being emotional. Then they made their way to Harbortown, the resort where Steve had died. Their first stop was room 506. Kim walked through the space without any reactions. She just glanced around, taking it all in, but there was just no sadness. And then they moved to room 606, where detectives asked her to retrace her steps from that night. Kim recounted the timeline, adding that Steve had chewed tobacco and smoked, two habits that he indulged in when drinking. But then she added something contradictory. Kim said she wasn't sure if Steve had purchased cigarettes or cigars for their trip. She hadn't seen any. At that point, Sergeant Karen Alt really wanted to shift the conversation and put more heat on her, so she asked Kim a direct question. Was she having an affair? Kim firmly denied it. Then they asked, "Do you know a U.S. Marine named Brad Winkler?" And her demeanor changed instantly. She lowered her head and she softly admitted the truth. "Yes," she whispered. Kim finally confessed that she had been having an affair with Brad. They had met months earlier and had been intimate, but she was adamant about one thing. She never intended to leave Steve for Brad. According to Kim, Steve hadn't even found out about the affair. And by the way, they had already spoken to Brad once they knew he existed, and Kim actually wrote him a letter the day she left for that trip with Steve. She said she loved Brad and couldn't wait for their future together. I mean, that's pretty telling, right? You would think.
Detective Elsie then pressed further, asking her how much did Steve drink that night. Kim insisted he had been drinking heavily, but again, this contradicted the evidence. That's when he slid a piece of paper across the table, the medical examiner's report. It showed Steve's blood alcohol level was 0.0. Kim just stared at it, her face drained of color. Well, that makes no sense. She repeated it over and over, saying, "I don't understand." She was visibly struggling to process the fact that Steve had been stone cold sober, a direct contradiction of her claims that he was heavily intoxicated. But Elsie wasn't done. He hit her with one last blow, that Steve had been dead before the fire started. Kim froze. Tears welled up in her eyes and stared at the report. How can that be? At this point, Detective Elsie leaned in and told her to tell him the whole truth. Kim paused, and then she asked something chilling. "If I tell the truth, can I go home and see my daughter?" The detectives didn't lie. They said, "If you tell us everything, you won't be going home." Kim exhaled. She agreed to talk, but only with her attorney.
This was really a missed opportunity because unfortunately a little later, another detective reflected on what had happened and he believed that Sergeant Alt had made a big mistake. She should have reassured Kim and told her, "Yeah, of course, we'll let you see your daughter, let her go home," and then arrested her after the confession that they wanted. Instead, Kim just shut down. She walked out of the interview room knowing that they were onto her. The detectives had to tighten their case up and fast because Kim wasn't done playing games. Later that evening, Kim met up with Mike and Maureen for dinner, and Kim confided in Maureen. Her voice was filled with frustration as she said, "The police think that I killed Steve." This wasn't the first time Kim had said this. The last time she said it, she thought Rachel thought that she had killed Steve. And Maureen had quickly come to her defense, asking why in the world would Rachel think that? Kim explained it was just one drunken night that she and Rachel were at a bar and she was mad at Steve and she said, "I want to kill him." But we know that's not how the story goes. But Maureen, being the good friend that she was, just said, "Forget about it. That's just a stupid conversation you had." But Kim saying that she thought the detectives were thinking she killed Steve, that was much bigger.
Maureen wanted to understand why Kim thought this. She said they were interrogating her all day, trying to make her say that she was guilty, and that all her friends had come forward accusing her. Maureen told Kim she needed to get a lawyer, still believing that Kim could be falsely accused.
But while Kim was sitting at dinner, Maryland State Police were stationed outside the Miller home, preparing to execute a search warrant. And at the same time, another team of officers was at Kim and Steve's home conducting a simultaneous raid. Inside the house, Lois, Kim's mom, was there with Kim and Steve's daughter, Anna. When the officers arrived, the stress of the search became way too much for her. Her blood pressure spiked, and Kim's brother Matt had to rush his mom to the emergency room. But the real discoveries were unfolding inside Kim and Steve's house.
As officers sifted the house, they found a collection of items that raised serious questions about Steve's death. Among them were letters from Steve to Kim expressing his love and desperation to save their marriage, 2 pamphlets about life insurance, a white box containing sympathy cards and Steve's cremation certificate, miscellaneous papers, business cards, and a letter from Kim to Steve. But the biggest red flag was 2 life insurance policies in Steve's name, worth a combined total of $450,000. Investigators suspected that Steve had never signed them and that Kim had forged his signature. They dug deeper. Back in the December of 1997, Steve's coverage was already doubled through his employer adding an accidental death benefit of $200,000. And Kim had already taken out another policy on Steve back in November of 1996 for $250,000. She had been paying $114.08 quarterly on this policy, ensuring that if Steve had died, she would be financially secure.
Kim had strategically positioned herself to benefit enormously from Steve's death, and they found something even more heartbreaking. I talked about this earlier. Steve's final words in his journal entries. Inside, he had poured his heart out, detailing the pain, confusion, and love he still felt for Kim right up until his final days. Starting with January 21st, 1998. He said, "I feel she doesn't understand how deeply I love her. I mean, real love. I'm afraid I won't get the chance to make this marriage right." Steve admitted to his depression, his awareness of the pain he had caused Kim, and his fear that she was no longer interested in repairing the relationship, but he wouldn't give up. He wrote, "I will never stop working and praying for Kim's love."
On January 27th of 1998, by this point, Steve had gone nearly a month without intimacy with Kim. All he wanted to do was hug her and hold her to feel close to him. But he knew he couldn't force her into affection. He wrote, "I will love Kim forever and don't care if we would never have sex again. I would trade sex for a night of holding each other and talking in a minute." Despite her indifference, Steve remained hopeful, saying, "It's funny how we take things for granted, then it's too late. If anything, I have learned I won't take people in my life for granted ever again."
It's really sad reading somebody's words like this. And then on January 29th of 1998, Steve wrote that they had gone to counseling, but he feared Kim and the therapist would decide their marriage should end. A few days later, on February 1st, desperate to rekindle their connection, Steve made another attempt at intimacy, and Kim shut him down. She called him needy, saying it was a turnoff, and Steve felt humiliated. He wrote, "I don't blame her for wanting to leave me after all the pain I've caused her, but I still hope that with time, she can love me again." He told himself he needed to back off to give her space, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. And God, that is just so sad, knowing like how much he loves this woman and how all she's doing is thinking about wanting him dead.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing for some people is to understand that you can't change people's mind.
Yeah.
You can try your hardest, but I mean, at that point, it's like, yeah, I don't know.
I just wish he would have had some insight, if he would have been, if the friends would have said something, like who would have not, I guess if it's her friend, why are you going to go to Steve and be like, "Yo, she's being weird. She's saying she wants you dead." But I would imagine that you're friends with both of them.
Yeah.
If you've known them that long.
I want to know deeper into the story about, he writes, "All the pain I caused you."
Right.
Like, what did he do? If he's just saving face, saying like, "I can see you're in pain. Whatever I did, I'm sorry. I don't know what it is,"
Because he didn't do things like clean the house and stuff. And she was like, "Oh, it's a lot for me." I mean, not to say it wasn't hurting her, but I think, she was taking a little to the extreme.
Right. On February 9th, 1998, less than a week before his death, despite everything he's been through, Steve thought things were getting better. He was looking forward to their Valentine's Day getaway, but was worried about Kim's health. She had symptoms that scared him. He wrote, "Kim's health comes first. All I wanted for her was to be healthy."
And to think that all she wanted was for him to be dead. And that same day, Kim had called Steve twice, telling him that she loved him. It made him really happy. But still, there was no intimacy, and Steve was willing to wait.
Then the final entry on February 12th, 1998. Kim came home late at night, 9:30 p.m. She was furious, and she accused Steve of trying to send her a message by locking the door and turning off the lights, as if to say that you are out too late, so I'm locking you out. But Steve was confused. In his journal, he clarified, "I had just gone to bed. It wasn't intentional." Kim's rage seemed irrational, and for the first time, Steve suspected something. He believed this weekend would be the test. He was about to find out if Kim truly wanted their marriage to work.
And now for Steve's last words. Throughout his journal, Steve was clinging to hope. He wrote about his desire to be a better husband, a better father, a better man. He wrote, quote, "Whether Kim believes it or not, I think she's the sexiest woman in the world. I won't push my emotions on her. I will let her figure it out. I will always be there for her and our daughter. I know I can't erase the pain of our past, but I can work towards a better future, end quote. Steve never got that future. He never knew that Kim wasn't trying to rebuild their marriage. She was preparing for his death. And now investigators had everything they needed to take her down.
Among the documents recovered from Kim and Steve's home, detectives found a letter Kim had written to Steve. But unlike Steve's pleas for love and reconciliation, Kim's tone was far more detached. Instead of affection, it read like a list of demands. She outlined specific changes she expected from him, highlighting their emotional differences and placing the burden of their failing marriage on his shoulders. She wanted Steve to be more considerate of both her and their daughter's feelings. She wanted him to stop being mean. She urged him to build friendships instead of retreating into isolation.
Kim also criticized his lack of initiative at home, which I spoke about. She wrote that Steve needed to express affection more freely without the fear of rejection or humiliation. He should invest in friendships outside their family and take on more household responsibilities without needing to be constantly reminded. She even urged him to watch TV less and spend more time engaging in activities that would bring their family closer. To detectives, the stark difference between Kim's cold requests and Steve's heartfelt journal entries painted a devastating picture.
As the police investigation closed in, Kim's composure began to crack. When officers arrived at the Miller home to execute a search warrant for her car, Kim was furious. Instead of cooperating, she threw her keys at the officers in frustration. Maureen watched in disbelief. If Kim was truly innocent, her behavior wasn't helping. Then Kim made another bizarre request. She asked Maureen to help her with a bath. She needed to relax. When Maureen entered the bathroom, she found something deeply unsettling. Kim was fully clothed, sitting on the toilet, and her words were slurred. Her movements were unsteady, and she muttered under her breath, "I didn't kill him." Beside her was an empty bottle of Xanax. Panic set in. Maureen shouted for Mike to call an ambulance.
Kim was rushed to Easton Memorial Hospital, and for a moment, Maureen feared the worst, that Kim had tried to exit this world under the pressure of Steve's death and the police investigation. But then came a shocking revelation. A toxicology report from the hospital showed that Kim had not ingested anything, none of those pills at all. It was just all an act. She just threw that bottle there, making them believe that. Investigators believe that Kim had staged this entire thing possibly to get sympathy or buy herself some more time. But physically, she was fine. Emotionally, though, she was unraveling. After the hospital incident, Maureen's concern for Kim deepened. Still, Kim needed an attorney, so Maureen stepped in, helping her contact this man named Harry Walsh. He was a respected defense attorney in their area, but securing his services was not going to be easy. He needed a $10,000 retainer, and neither Kim or Steve's family were willing to provide the funds. Kim was livid. She expected support, but instead, she was being shut out. At this point, Kim was transferred to Upper Shore Community Health Center, a mental health facility for evaluation. But that didn't stop the inevitable. At 4:00 a.m. on February 25th, police arrived and Kim was officially arrested and taken to the Talbot County Court Commissioner, where she was formally charged with Steve's murder and held without bail. Despite the seriousness of the charges, Harry Walsh agreed to take on her case, and he even waived the retainer fee because this was a high-profile trial, and he thought, I can get some publicity for it, things like that. But Kim's legal troubles were far from over. After her arrest, she was transferred to a maximum security psychiatric facility where she would undergo further evaluations. And at that point, the truth was out. Kim Hricko wasn't a grieving widow. She was about to go on trial for murder. So we're going to list out the key incriminating evidence found in this investigation. Dr. Timothy Wex, chief anesthesiologist at Holy Cross Hospital where Kim worked, confirmed that succinylcholine was kept in the operating room, but not tracked. These drugs were highly lethal, but they weren't considered at risk for abuse because if you took them, you would immediately die. And there was no way to track if Kim had stolen these items.
When asked if Kim could have taken the drugs, Dr. Wex's response was blunt, absolutely. As a surgical technician, Kim had direct access to these drugs and likely administered them herself.
Right, so she was allowed to use them on patients. Now let's talk about the cigars. The investigators recovered a pack of Backwoods mild and natural cigars from room 506, and this led detectives to trace its origin. After checking 25 liquor and smoke shops, they found a match at Astor's Liquors in Laurel. The store owner confirmed the exact price tag found at the crime scene on the package was the same. This had a very unique type of ink that was used and the style of the print, so they knew it was from this place. Now, Deborah Grave Coles, a store clerk, identified Kim as the person who bought those cigars. Now, Kim stood out because she snapped at this clerk when this clerk asked her simply, "Where did you get your hair colored?" Deborah loved Kim's beautiful red hair, so all she was doing was complimenting her, but that pushed her over the edge. Kim was so rude back to her because she didn't want her to think that she dyed her hair. And this incident stayed in the clerk's mind because she had such a reaction over something so small.
Finally, on March 31st, a Harbortown golf course employee found a hypodermic needle near the 5th hole, and it was about a mile from room 506. It was then turned over to the police. The Maryland State Police Crime Lab tested it, but no significant findings were made. But the fact that it was out there leaned toward Kim using it and discarding it at some point.
Right. She could have thrown it out a window on her way out. I mean, you don't always find those kind of needles just laying around the exact location where this murder occurred.
Yeah, playing golf and hypodermic needles don't really go hand in hand.
Well, I mean, somebody could have had diabetes or something and doing insulin. You never know. And we're not going to go into the full details of this trial, but we are going to point out key trial evidence and testimonies. So for the pretrial rulings, the judge allowed Kim's statements to police, but they did exclude any evidence of her attempt on her own life because they thought it was prejudicial. The judge barred testimony about the arson dog, Bear, remember him, because there was no scientific proof that accelerants had been used. Now, the prosecution's case highlighted everyone close to Kim who admitted she was over her marriage, wanted Steve dead, and was planning the perfect murder by injecting him with succinylcholine and staging the scene as a smoking accident to gain as much insurance as possible. The witnesses were Maureen Miller, Ken Burgess, and Brad Winkler, who testified about Kim's affair and behavior after Steve's death. Norma and Jenny, Kim's former coworkers, who had also confirmed they knew about her affair with Brad, and Doris Graves Cole, the clerk that identified Kim as the person who purchased the cigar pack found at the crime scene. They also had Rachel McCoy, who said that Kim had discussed killing Steve in detail, and Jennifer Hricko, who was Steve's sister, who testified that Steve had never smoked cigars, contradicting Kim's claims.
The prosecution also brought forth forensic and medical evidence from both the pathologist Dr. David Fowler, who ruled out death by fire and found no physical cause of death, so it was undetermined, but the manner was homicide. The FBI toxicologist Mark LeBeau also told the jury he tested for succinylcholine, but found nothing because it becomes undetectable over time.
Now for a brief rundown of the defense's case. They brought in forensic and alternative theories by putting pathologist Dr. John Adams on the stand. He claimed that since the cause of death was undetermined, like you said, Steve could have been alive when the fire started. He suggested flash fires and slow burning fires, and that could explain why no carbon monoxide was found in his system. The defense also called character witnesses to vouch for Kim. For example, Kim's uncle Dave claimed that he had seen Steve smoke cigars. That countered the testimony that Steve was not a smoker. Kim's mom, Lois Wolf, described Kim as grief-stricken and emotionally unstable after Steve's death. And there was another witness who claimed to have overheard Mike Miller speculate that Steve might have planned to take his own life. But Mike denied ever saying this. Surprisingly, even though she loved to talk and had such a big mouth, Kim did not testify in her own defense, which I think was a very wise decision. I don't know if it would have really mattered, though, because the jury deliberated for just 3 hours before delivering a guilty verdict. Kim showed no emotion as the verdict was read, while Steve's family, on the other hand, were crying in the courtroom. Jurors later revealed the two major reasons for their decision: Kim's access to the succinylcholine as a surgical tech, and the fire investigator's testimony proving that the fire wasn't accidental. In March of 1999, Kim Hricko faced sentencing, but the courtroom wasn't just about her fate. It was a stage for the pain and the devastation that she left behind because, of course, the victim impact statements. Steve's mother, Mary, spoke of the unbearable loss her family endured, and Steve's father couldn't even speak without breaking down. His health had deteriorated since losing his son.
Their granddaughter, Anna, had been ripped from them, barely able to see her paternal family, and therefore Mary begged the court for a severe sentence. Steve's sister, Jennifer, described him as kind, gentle, and devoted. She knew his death and Kim's conviction would haunt their daughter Anna for life.
Right. She's also a victim in all of this. I mean, she's losing both of her parents, even though, her mother's not dying, but her mother's taken away. And then there were Kim's family members who begged for leniency. Her grandparents described Kim as caring, polite, and religious. Her stepmother, Karen, described her as a woman of integrity, selflessness, and she was kind. Her aunt recalled Kim's thoughtfulness, citing how she arranged food deliveries after a funeral of another family member. And Ronald, another family member, said that Kim had been a bright, intelligent child. But I'm sitting here thinking, why would any of that matter after the fact? And the judge saw through it all. Kim's crime was not impulsive, it was calculated. She planned it meticulously, showing a cold disregard for Steve's life. She posed a serious risk to others in that resort that night, and if she was let out. And for these reasons, and probably more, Kim was sentenced to life in prison, lost 30 years for arson, served concurrently.
And she appealed her sentence.
Of course she did.
But the court upheld the original decision.
Now, one thing I really wanted to point out is that since Kim's conviction, forensic science has advanced, and researchers at an institute in Sweden and teams in the US had developed a method to detect succinylcholine even in embalmed tissue. This was a breakthrough that could have helped solve cases like this, where the drug had vanished. If this technology would have existed in 1998, would it have sealed Kim's fate even sooner? Well, you know what? I would have said yes before I stumbled upon this other really interesting occurrence. When I was looking at Harbor Town Golf Resort for pictures, I was shocked to learn it was permanently closed because it was so beautiful and it seemed to be thriving. Well, guess what? It burned down. And here's what's interesting. There was no one there at the time. The cause was an electrical failure in a space between the exterior wall. And listen, I am not saying that this woman did not do it, but it's just very interesting that a fire broke out in a wall and it was electrical. But of course, in Steve's case, they already investigated electrical causes and they ruled them out. I just needed to share that to be thorough and I couldn't leave it out. Clearly, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming in Kim's case. She brought those cigars that she bought, the life insurance pertaining to a smoking accident, posing Steve next to the magazines that she despised, getting a final dig at him, I guess. That's really disgusting. But they really didn't have proof forensically in the sense of like medically being able to show that Kim did it. Now, this fire happened, I believe, recently, like in 2020, and I'm showing pictures on the screen. Isn't it kind of like ironic?
It is.
That they were like, oh, a fire. No, it couldn't have happened. And then the same thing with no one even there. What are your thoughts? I always like to ask the audience because that's all we have for you today. I mean, what did you think about everything?
I feel like she did it.
I mean, there was more than enough evidence, right?
Right.
But
Especially
it was
those massive life insurance policies, and she knew exactly where they were. She was waiting. She told all of her friends all the things she wanted to do.
What kind of person believes that she can say something like that and her friends are going to stay by her side?
As long as they still love her.
Unconditionally. Are you ready for the answer? The secret word is footprint.
Now look closely. There's a muddy footprint on the carpet near Claire's body.
But whose is it? Was someone else there that night? If you want to continue solving the mystery, download June's Journey for free on iOS, Android, or PC by using our special link below in the description box or by scanning our QR code on the screen. And thanks so much to June's Journey for sponsoring today's video. But that's all we have for you today. Leave anything you'd like below. Remember to always be kind. You never know who's reading the comments. The family could be down there reading everything that you're leaving behind. We'll see you in our next video.
And we'll see you at CrimeCon.
Bye.
He had expected to find a devastated window, a woman
Window?
Widow. Window. I was like, fire breaking out windows. Okay, I get it.
Devastated window.